The Syria conflict, weapons or words? In the interview, CDU foreign policy spokesman Philipp Missfelder.
Mr. Missfelder, let's assume both suspicions turn out to be true. There was a chemical weapons attack, and the Syrian regime under President Assad is responsible. What happens then?
That's a difficult question. I believe, because nothing was done for so long in the last year and a half, that many options were lost. For example, it is now difficult to support the opposition, as it were, because the opposition is splintered into a number of small groups. One can't presume one is better than the other. It has become more complicated than that.
A few days ago, one had the impression that the West couldn't wait to teach Syria a lesson. But now that mood has changed. Today, the emphasis is on diplomacy, not only in Germany. What is behind this change?
Well, one sees very clearly in this debate, especially in Britain, a realization that people haven't forgotten the Iraq War and Afghanistan. Powers that used to be quick to get involved in military operations have become more restrained, more careful. I don't regard this as a step back. I do regret any misapprehensions that may occur as a result, but I don't consider it a step back. Indeed, I view this change favorably. As a matter of principle, I believe we should always be cautious when considering military action.
Germany was criticized for its decision not to participate in military action in Libya, and today Germany says it won't take part in a military intervention in Syria. Are we avoiding our international responsibility?
What we have in Germany is a very broad and open discussion that is completely at odds with itself. Often the same person will express conflicting reactions. When people see terrible atrocities, regardless of the conflict, then they say, we have to do something. Something must be done. At the same time, if you ask these people, what should we do? Should we send in the Bundeswehr? They'll turn around and say, no, under no circumstances should Germany send in military forces. That is what we see in Germany. And to be honest, I can understand both reactions. After Afghanistan, people have become disillusioned with military solutions. People question their effectiveness, but at the same time, no one wants to look the other way as atrocities are committed. Most Germans struggle with this contradiction.
Chancellor Angela Merkel and Foreign Minister Guido Westerwelle have demanded consequences. What kind of consequences are we talking about if we've already ruled out any chance of military action?
I believe their statements were aimed at signaling to our allies that we stand on their side. It's important not to make problems we see at the UN our own, or to say we're responsible for them. The UN has the responsibility to act, and the UN has a duty to protect Syria's civilian population. The responsibility to protect. But there has been no mandate on Syria, not because of the US, Britain or France, but because Russia and China have blocked it. But it is, of course, morally and politically a different assessment about what are the causes of this blockage in the UN.
Have the Chancellor and the Foreign Minister done enough to persuade Russia to lift its veto?
I was there on a number of occasions when top Russian and top Chinese representatives met with Merkel and Westerwelle to discuss Syria. And I have to say that when our Chancellor was in St. Petersburg, where a number of issues of interest to the public were on the table, including German art looted after World War II, that she made a very strong effort to change Vladimir Putin's mind. But the problem, as I see it, is that we're discussing the matter from very different standpoints. Germany approaches Syria with a measure of sympathy for Syria's civilian population. Russia has taken, in my opinion, a very cynical geopolitical stance on the matter. They were saying, you, the West, want to wipe out our positions of influence in the Middle East. And that is extremely unsettling, the fact that we just can't see eye to eye on the matter.
The Chancellor recently called for people to make Syrian refugees feel welcome here, since they've been through such great hardship. Does that mean we're going to take in more Syrian refugees than planned?
I'm certain that Germany is in a position to take on more refugees. Up until now, we have gone to great measures to support Syrian refugees in the region. For example, in Turkey, Kurdistan, northern Iraq, and of course in Jordan, without Western help, those refugee camps would fall apart. However, I believe that we, as a wealthy nation, could take on more refugees, if just for a short period of time. We also have a moral obligation to do that, but one shouldn't confuse the refugee problem with other problems. We are not talking about people falsely seeking asylum. We're talking about people who have really suffered persecution and who need our help and our solidarity.
Turkey is one of the few nations willing to take part in a military intervention in Syria. Germany has Patriot rockets and German soldiers on the Turkish-Syrian border. In your opinion, is there a risk that Germany will be drawn into a conflict there?
Yes, and there are legal interpretations that say if Turkey is in fact involved in military intervention, that would change the character of our mandate. So far, the Bundeswehr's mandate has been a defensive one. And it is correct, in my opinion, that Germany must assist our NATO partners should they require our aid. Turkey is an ally, a very important ally of Germany. Such action would fall under the Bundeswehr's mandate. That would also include help for other countries. For example, with Israel, we could very well justify contributing to their defense to protect an ally. But the legal question remains whether the current parliamentary mandate is sufficient. I would not define such action as taking part in a military intervention. That would be splitting hairs and wrong. One can't deny friends and allies military support in that type of situation.
You mentioned Israel. If Syria moves against Israel in a retaliatory strike, what will German support look like?
We definitely have a duty, a moral duty, and also a political duty to stand on the side of Israel. Should Israel be attacked, there is no question that we will do everything necessary to protect Israel. Of course, there is also the question of necessity. Israel has a very strong military of its own. The U.S. also strongly supports Israel. It depends in large part what will be asked of us. I can say when it comes to Israeli security, we will do everything necessary to protect Israel, from military aid to air support. But it will be limited support because Israel is better equipped than we are, for example.
President Obama says he doesn't want to force a regime change, and he doesn't want a no-fly zone or troops on the ground. So what can a limited action actually achieve? Is it just to send a message?
I have to say I don't understand that position either. I'm at a loss at what to think when I read and when I hear those statements. And I find them to be a bit contradictory. People are speaking about surgical attacks, so we are talking about extremely narrow actions. That kind of slap on the wrist only works as a deterrent. As far as it's possible, how big does the attack have to be? How big the risk of civilian casualties, of third parties getting involved? Or is it not the case that we face the general question, who will benefit from this type of intervention? And then I have to come back to our position towards Syria's opposition parties. Parties that we don't necessarily support 100%.
When you consider the UN Charter's prohibition on the use of force, this prohibition is pretty absolute. Doesn't it make sense in a situation like this one, where the Security Council is completely gridlocked and cannot do anything, to look at ways of working around it?
International law is constantly developing and moving forward on a case-by-case basis. In contrast with the civil law that we have here in Germany, it's not solely dependent on the written text. But the text of the UN Charter is extremely important. There are situations, like with Kosovo, where we had a moral obligation to knowingly violate the UN Charter and at the same time say we're doing so to protect people. The so-called responsibility to protect evolved out of that intervention, where you say, we want the UN to get involved. The world's policeman shouldn't be the US, it should be the UN. But unfortunately, the UN doesn't live up to that. I would invest more effort into why we have so little confidence in Russia and why the West and China and Russia so often adopt such a confrontational stance towards each other.
We could also make the observation that Europeans have failed to take a united position in the crisis. Does that weaken the position of the EU?
I think it would be desirable, of course, if we in Europe could come to a consensus more quickly and form a united front on international matters. But I have to say, especially in this past week, there have been so many twists and turns. A unilateral announcement that allies of ours want to take action. The British Parliament's vote to stop Cameron's plans. Those are developments that you cannot predict, and it would be best if we could coordinate in a more effective way before making public pronouncements. How strong Brussels is depends on Europe's nations. Brussels doesn't have the power to order a consensus. That would never work. It's better for Brussels to counsel and coordinate official stances on issues. I believe a number of the public announcements that we heard this week were a bit premature, especially when you consider that most countries that have waged war in the past no longer have public support to enter into new conflicts.
Thank you, Mr. Missfelder.